Hello, and welcome to this mini podcast series, When Relationships Go Wrong, with Hoot Singles and LICC. My name is Hattie Webb. I'm the founder of Hoot Singles, my much-loved side hustle where I run Christian singles nights to enable singles to meet, mingle and have fun. And I'm joined by the lovely Sophie Sanders, who is the marketing and communications lead at LICC. I've had the joy of getting to know her through this collaboration, and she's honestly amazing. Her friends call her the Christian Bridget Jones, and she's currently, very excitingly, writing a book about relationships, which you'll get a little taster of in this 4-part blog series Sophie has written alongside this podcast, covering the challenges of singleness and dating. They're only short, so we're looking forward to chatting them through in a bit more depth. So go and check out the blog post on the LICC website, but don't worry if you don't manage to read any of them, you can still listen and follow along. I know so many of you are going to feel deeply encouraged and seen by Sophie's story and vulnerability. Thank you so much for joining me, Sophie, and without further ado, let's dive in. Hello and welcome to part 1 of When Relationships Go Wrong with Hoot Singles and LICC. This first episode is all about the invisible singles. And so Sophie, we're both 27. You're single. I'm 8-9 months into a relationship. I was in a long-term relationship and then single for 2 years. You've been single for over 7 years. So I think it's fair to say we can both speak to feeling single and invisible and actually unwanted at times. And when we were preparing for this, we were laughing because we thought this episode really reminded us of that meme that keeps going around from Pride and Prejudice of the character Charlotte, where she says, I'm 27 years old, I've no money and no prospects, I'm already a burden to my parents and I'm frightened. And of course, we're 27, so we can maybe relate to some of those feelings.
Absolutely.
That Charlotte was expressing through the book and then obviously the multiple films. And actually, Sophie, for those of you that have read the blog post, you'll know that Sophie has linked each blog post to a Bible passage. So we're going to start with that before we talk about this very juicy topic further. And the passage that you've used for this one is Genesis 29, verses 16 to 17 and 31. But the bit we're going to focus in on now is verse 17. Which says, Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. And Sophie, you wrote that this passage is a reminder that God sees our feelings of rejection, hears our prayers and cares about our future. And you've been through a lot, and I'd just love to know actually, how has this been true in your life?
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks so much for having me today, Hattie. I mean, for starters, we can all see that I'm wearing a pair of glasses today. So I've obviously got the weak eyes that Leah had. But if we kind of pull that out a little bit further, I live with quite a few chronic health conditions. And I talk about this in my blog post, but quite often the kind of bruises and the scars and the bits of technology that are sometimes attached to my body can make me feel deeply unattractive. The world tells us, culture tells us, social media tells us that physical attraction is kind of the foremost priority when someone is looking for someone to date. And I think when you have some of those things about your body that you feel really insecure about, it's easy to think that no one could ever want you. And I've definitely really had to battle those feelings, particularly over the last few years, kind of realising that actually personality can also be really attractive and that as a person, you come to life, your personality brings your physical appearance to life. And that actually the kind of attraction that actually I want is an attraction that's to my whole self.
Yeah.
I would want my spouse to be physically attracted to me, yes, but I wouldn't want that to be the only thing. And I think that's been a real journey for me, to realise that attraction is so much more holistic than I maybe thought a few years ago.
Yeah, and actually that's the attraction that lasts, right? Because we're all going to get old. We're all going to end up looking very differently. And actually, you never know what might happen. You know, you said about your health conditions as well. You never know which turn life is going to go down. And so actually, what is it that is attracting you to someone that's actually going to last through all of those potential changes? And, you know, it says that in Proverbs, I think that, you know, beauty is fleeting And it's true, like that kind of physical beauty isn't going to last throughout your whole life. So it can't be what you're basing the foundation of a relationship on. Although, of course, physical attraction is important as well. And yeah, I guess about, you said that God kind of sees and hears our feelings of rejection. And, when you've been single for a long time and you just feel like it's rejection after rejection, it can be really easy to forget that. But actually, where has God, shown you that he does still care about how hard singleness is? Because actually, a lot of the kind of the advice in the Christian space is singleness is a gift. You should enjoy it while it lasts, and those things are true. But actually, it doesn't take away from the fact that it can be a really painful, really hard time when those desires aren't being met.
Yeah, you make such a good point. I think it's those narratives in the Christian world where singleness is sugar-coated that can be most damaging and can really strike a nerve. And I think for me, singleness isn't probably what I would have chosen for my 20s. A lot of my friends got married at 21, 22. They married the first guy they dated. It was kind of a love story that I would have dreamt of. And so I think it's been a kind of a slow journey for me of firstly realising that God sees my feelings around relationships. I think if we wind back to when I was 17 or 18, I think I probably thought that God blushed a little bit when he saw relationships, that actually there was something kind of almost a little bit too juicy for God. And so I didn't really talk to God about my desires for a husband or my desires for holistic attraction. I kind of thought, I better not sort of say that to God. And I think the first step to realising that God saw my feelings of rejection was firstly to speak to him about it.
Yeah.
And to acknowledge.
It sounds so simple, doesn't it?
And I think now I sort of think, oh, come on, Sophie.
Yeah.
You said that you believed in this all-seeing, all-knowing God. And yet you kind of thought that God didn't want to see your dating life or your lack of dating life, to be honest, in my situation. And so I think that for me was such a game changer.
Yeah.
And then realising that I didn't just have to kind of pray these generic prayers, which I deemed to be really holy, like, God, let your will be done in my dating life. Now, I completely believe that. I believe that God has a plan and a purpose for my life and for everyone's life, for this world more generally. But actually, I could say to him, God, if a spouse is in your plan for me, I want to pray for him right now that he is growing in Christ-likeness. I want to pray that he is growing into a man of your heart, God. And actually to pray for someone who is kind and compassionate, who seeks justice, who has the joy of the Lord. I mean, that is my favourite verse. The joy of the Lord is my strength, from Nehemiah 8:10. And actually that is a verse which has completely transformed my perspective as well. Joy transcends circumstances. I might be unhappily single, but I'm joyfully single. Those two things are really different. And I'm joyfully single because I know that it's no accident, the season of life I'm in right now. And my heart still longs for a relationship, but it longs for a relationship in God's timing with someone who is chasing God and pursuing God like I am. And actually, it doesn't long for a relationship if it's going to be something that draws me away from Jesus. And I feel like God has really shifted my heart in the last few years on that, to actually be able to say that and to mean that, and for that to come out really organically and unscripted in a podcast. So praise the Lord for that.
Praise the Lord. That is amazing. And I would actually agree that the thing that really transformed my singleness was the honest prayers. And in reality, sometimes that was crying to God in bed at night because I was just like, God, this isn't what I thought my life was going to look like at this point. When I was a teenager going to Soul Survivor and Spring Harvest every year, I thought, that I would be married in my early 20s or, have kids by now. And especially because I was in a long-term relationship as well, you kind of plan those things with that person as well. And you kind of think, okay, well, by that stage we'll be married and then have kids at that stage. So then when all of that comes crumbling down, it can be very confusing. But actually, it was amazing just kind of bringing that confusion to God. And actually, as I was navigating, I kind of went right back to the drawing board and was navigating after actually being cheated on after a long-term relationship. I was like, and we'll get onto this in further episodes, but I was like, why do I even want, like, to date? Why do I have this desire? Why do I want marriage when things can go wrong? And so actually praying to God about those things. Why have you placed this desire on my heart? What does that mean? What does a godly marriage look like for me if that's something that I want? And actually being in conversation with God about those things and waiting and listening and seeing what he had to say, and obviously seeing what his word said as well, was so transformational, because then it, you know, also transformed the way I dated, but then transformed the way that in turn I saw singleness. And now I also can look back and be like, wow, that was such a transformational time, because I learned so much in that time because I had this space. And of course, talking of singleness, you know, Jesus was single, and I know that's talked about a lot in the singleness space, but weirdly it's often forgotten, I think, especially in the church. It's forgotten that Paul was single and feels very strongly about the importance of singleness and the time and the space that gives you to spend with God. But why do you still think, given those things, singles do feel so invisible, unwanted, neglected in the church more widely? I know that's a big question, but
a huge question, but we love to ask them. So I think if you look right back to the creation story in Genesis chapter 1, we see that humans, male and female, are created in the image of a relational God. We're created for relationship. And so it's no wonder that we long for relationship. And I think in our culture, we very much think of relationships being romantic. But actually, those two biblical figures you just mentioned, well, Jesus, God, the King of the universe, and Paul, they were single, but they weren't without intimate relationships. Because actually, intimate relationships can be friendships, they can be familial relationships, they can be romantic relationships. And I think the problem in the church actually is that romantic relationships are put up on a pedestal. They are the public relationships that are celebrated. And so that is what we yearn for, because that is what we see modelled. So I think of, you know, when you're at a prayer meeting or you're in a service, and what are we praying for? What are we announcing? We're announcing engagements and marriages and births. What about job promotions? Or what about a friendship that has weathered a really, really difficult storm? Those things aren't talked about. And I think as well, so much of the church calendar is based on school years, academic school years. And it makes loads of sense, because there are young people in the church, there are parents in the church who are also bound by that. But actually, if you're single, you're probably going on holiday outside of school terms. So everything just stops.
Yeah, I find August really hard.
August is probably my least favourite month.
Yeah, it's such a dead month, because everything kind of stops. There's no connect group, life group, small groups, whatever you call them. And church just goes really quiet. It's very strange.
It's really strange. And I think it's one of those things as well that you almost feel more single because church is a little bit emptier. It's more obvious who's sitting by themselves because there are spaced seats.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of like, oh, here I am. I've arrived. I'm sitting by myself. Okay, this is a little bit awkward. Like, do I get my water bottle out? Do I go to the loo? But actually, I think taking a step back and being like, actually, God's created me for a relationship, and I can still have really meaningful, intimate relationships with the people around me here. And actually, I can still experience a lot of that, in some ways, holistic attraction to another person, to their personhood who God's created them to be. Yes, it might not be that romantic physical attraction, but there can be like that emotional connection. There can be that spiritual connection. That can be the doing life alongside one another. And I think the problem is that churches don't tell singles all the things they can have.
Yeah.
Almost the emphasis is on what you can't have. And I think maybe we just need to kind of flip that around, flip it on its head and say, hey, singles, you guys can still have really intimate, meaningful relationships.
Yeah, because it's so interesting that when we think of intimacy, our mind jumps to physical intimacy within a romantic relationship or marriage. We don't think of all the other versions of intimacy that actually we can get from friendships, or as you said, familial relationships as well. I mean, I've been absolutely blown away by what God has done in my life through my friendships, especially over the last kind of only 2-3 years. But I actually never imagined that I could experience friendship in the way that I have, especially with regards to emotional intimacy, and actually feeling like, okay, although I still desire to be married one day, actually I feel like so much of that kind of emotional connection that I'm craving is actually being really fulfilled through friendships, and that's through really investing in them, praying for those friendships, and that in itself I feel like has actually also just given me a lot of hope for romantic relationships, because I've been like, well, see what God is doing in this area of my life and what he can do in just relationships more generally, and also everything you learn through building and growing those kind of friendships as well. And Sophie, we were talking about hugging before, because of course, you know, the reason why singleness can be so hard is actually just because you really miss or you really desire that kind of physical intimacy. But we were speaking about how much we hug, and I know you were saying that you're not naturally a big hugger.
Oh, no.
No.
Oh, no.
But I was really challenged by something my friend said at church, where she was just like, there's so much power in a hug, and like she is just such a good friend because she's so good at just like not only hugging you, but actually just making it like a really long, like warm, like hug. She just, you know, those people that you're like, you're just a really good hugger.
I think it's a gift.
Gosh, it is a gift. I was like, gosh, I really don't like hug people enough. Like I only really hug my really kind of close friends, which probably is right. But this got us thinking, didn't it, about hugs, because I was like, I'm sure there's some kind of stat on how many hugs you need. And I Googled it, and it said that aiming for 8 hugs a day is considered the optimal amount to maintain happiness and well-being, with 4 hugs for survival a day, and 12 for growth. And I was thinking, gosh, like, I don't think I get 4 a day.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm still alive based on that stat.
Well, yeah.
I mean,
how am I even like remotely happy?
I know. I mean, my friends will really laugh watching this. I remember it really clearly at university. We sat round and we did our love languages test as me and my flatmates. And out on mine, bottom of the pile was 0 for physical touch. Everyone honestly couldn't believe it. They were like, Sophie, are you literally kind of subhuman? That's so bizarre.
Subhuman.
And I think, do you know what I think it is? I think it's a trust thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm really not a hugger with people that I don't know well.
Yeah.
It's not a default way that I show love to other people. But I'm going to make a bit of a confession here, Hattie. I actually love a hug.
Oh,
I
so
love
you
a
do
hug.
love a
I do love a
hug.
hug, but I'm not a huggy person.
Interesting.
And actually,
so it's when it's really meaningful.
and
that's
comes
right, yeah.
from a place of relationship. And I think actually I do feel more fully human and more fully alive when I've experienced that warmth. And kind of when we were prepping for this podcast, I surveyed a few singles, and you know, without fail, they all mentioned hugging.
Yeah.
They can go for days without physical contact, and that it is really painful.
Yeah.
Really, really painful.
Yeah, because you do crave it.
You do.
And we forget you don't need to be in a romantic relationship for that. But actually, it does take probably some action from your part to consciously think, okay, who out of my friends have I not shown love to recently in that way?
And I don't think it just has to be friends either. I look after a little boy sometimes. His name is Theo. Shout out to Theo. And when he gives me a hug, he's 18 months old, it honestly melts my heart. And I can almost feel my breathing just settling down, that sense of calm, of being wanted, of being loved. I'm actually spending Valentine's Day with Theo. So
Love
he is
that.
my Valentine.
Love that.
But I think there is that...
Lucky Theo.
Oh, lucky Theo. But I think there's that thing about, actually, when you're 18 months, you don't really analyse that.
No.
You don't really analyse. He wants physical contact. He wants that affirmation.
Yeah.
And actually, he doesn't sort of think, oh, is Sophie a huggy person or not a huggy person? He recognises that we have a trusting relationship, that there is warmth, that we spend time together. And that is his natural outpouring of our relationship together. You know, he only has a few words at the moment, but actually that's something, a way in which he can manifest and show that love. And I sometimes think in British culture, we're a bit like, oh, oh, is that overstepping the mark? Is that over-friendly?
It's a cultural thing as well.
And obviously we have to be so careful, particularly not knowing where people are coming from. And we'll get onto this in another episode, but particularly people who've experienced abuse, that touch could be really triggering.
Yeah.
So obviously this needs to be boundaried, but I think there is something to say that actually, particularly with singles, asking them like, do you want a hug?
Yeah.
Is a really good place to start in loving them well.
Yeah, for sure. Love a hug. And I think, just talking about invisible singles, I wonder if actually you've ever experienced, because this will lead on to our next question about how you can support singles, but it's just made me think about kind of the reaction sometimes that people have when you're single is almost that, oh, maybe there's kind of something wrong with you because you're single, or you almost just assume that married people have it all together, or they must be really great because someone else wanted to marry them. And I've really struggled with that as well. And actually, maybe I've had to catch myself as well for actually thinking that of others, or saying to people, oh, I can't believe you're single, meaning it in a nice way, but actually, why should that be such a shock?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've said it before, and I've had it said about me. And I think the more it sat with me, I kind of think it's just such an unhelpful thing to say, because actually it's not a judgment on a person that they have not met someone with whom they want to share their life with in such a deep way. There could be so many reasons why someone is single.
Yeah.
They could have experienced trauma or abuse. They could have had a really difficult breakup. They could have been cheated on. They could be same-sex attracted.
Yeah.
Or just really simply, they've never met that person that they really have a spark with.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean they're not a fab person. They're not a fab friend. In fact, some of the singles I know are some of the most loving, compassionate, sacrificial, warm, godly people I know. But actually that is not what God would have for them in this season of their life. And I think almost by removing that statement, and I hold my hands up that I've said it to you, that actually maybe we can start to reframe that kind of discourse around singleness, that there must be something wrong.
Yeah, or that they must be matched up straight away.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, they might not even want to be.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think that's a great point.
Yeah, we could talk about this for so much longer, but these are short and snappy episodes, so I'm going to get to the last question, because actually at the end of each of your blog posts you've asked the reader a question, so I thought it would be nice to ask you those questions too. So for this one, at the end you've asked, how can you best love friends, siblings or colleagues who are single?
Yeah, it's a great question, one that I wrote myself, but I think it's been really interesting to actually proactively ponder this. Actually, what, as a single woman in the church myself, what could really support me? And I think there are two things that really kind of have been on my heart in relation to this question. The first is that sometimes I just want to air that it's hard being single. I want to lament the hardships that I face because of that, whether that's higher council tax bills, or whether that's loneliness, or whether that's that longing for a family, or whether it's just simply that there is something that I've asked God for that I dream about and that he hasn't answered in the way that I would choose. And so I think we can be quick to try and say, your person will come along, or it's such a gift being single, or I wish I was single. But actually sometimes just sitting with that friend and saying, I hear you and God hears you. And yeah, it can be really hard. But then I think moving from that pace of lament to practical action, and being really intentional and initiating things with your single friends. We were chatting about this earlier, but I live by myself. And so if I don't organise something social, I don't see anyone. And so actually when my friends who are dating or married proactively take the initiative and invite me to do something, there is such a weight lifted off my shoulders, because the kind of admin and the thought and the effort that sometimes goes into just having like a basic kind of social interaction in a day can be huge. And so some of the times I feel most loved when my friends say, hey, do you want to go for a coffee? Hey, do you want to go and watch this film? Hey, do you want to come and join our family for lunch today? Hey, do you want to go for a walk? Or, do you know, even if sometimes they just drop round a bunch of flowers for no reason other than the fact that they love me as a friend and they want me to feel seen and known and loved. And I think all of those things are in some ways so easy to do, but they're so easy to forget as well.
Yeah, such a good response. And I wouldn't add anything to that. I couldn't have put it better myself. And actually, I'm just going to wrap up this episode with a perfect summary that actually is part of the blog post. And you wrote, God doesn't promise a spouse or that singleness will be easy, but he does promise to see our feelings of rejection, hear our prayers, and care about our future. Thank you for talking to me all about singleness, Sophie.
Oh, you're so welcome.